I wanted to be harsh on this movie.
Right.
I wanted to. I wanted to examine this movie as critically as I could. And as a film, I think it is flawed. When the time travel came up, I was like, oh, I'm gonna rip the time travel in this movie apart. Um, I will say though, after actually I made a diagram for myself for this movie. The time travel actually works really well. As whether or not time travel should have been introduced to Harry Potter is a whole different discussion. But as far as time travel mechanics go,
Yeah.
I gotta give it to J.K. Rowling on this one, which is not something I am proud to say. But I will say it works actually weirdly well. So it's funny because this movie, as far as its mechanics work, kind of the opposite of Tenet as far as how the mechanic works. Which is something I enjoy. All right. So as far as time travel in this movie goes, we get two rules, right?
Right.
The first is Dumbledore explains three turns should be necessary, and what he's saying is for every turn is 1 hour, right? So that's our first rule: is 1 turn per hour. Okay. The second is don't interact with yourself, right? I will come back to that rule later. There is a third rule though that they don't say, but it is clearly a rule. You travel back in time, but you do not travel in space. So wherever it is that you want to be, as far as the reversing of time goes, put yourself geographically where you need to be, right? And I'm going to come back to why that's important later and why I think that this mechanic actually works weirdly well. So as far as the interaction thing goes, they break this rule almost immediately. Where Hermione is throwing rocks at the back of Harry's head. And I get that he's not seeing her, but the rule was don't interact. This is absolutely an interaction. Whatever. I think it's actually, it works, even though the words they chose for the rule were a poor choice of words.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, these actions happen to them in their past, right? So there's some retro causality that's happening. It's the loop, right? We don't see the loop, but the loop is happening.
It's happening. Right.
Yeah.
And the loop will always happen. The loop will always happen. And that's why earlier in the film, before they time traveled, it was already happening as well, with the pebble going through the window and hitting Harry in the head, because the loop is always the loop, is always the loop, is always the loop.
Right. Right. So I made a diagram here that I was talking about earlier, and I'm gonna share my screen with you. Here it is. Okay, so this is very crude, but okay. Jesus. So this is not in reference to the climax of the movie where they time travel together. This is just in reference to Hermione doing her classes. Okay, so this is Hermione, and this is classroom 1 where she's studying something that's not. Let's say this is her studying runes, right? Classroom 1 is runes. Classroom 2 is divination, where she pops in later, right? Okay. So divination is going on with Harry and Ron. Hermione's over here in runes, right? And class goes on. 1 hour goes by, presumably, and then class is over, right? So is divination. Well, she travels to the future, or I guess her present of divination. She uses the time turner, and she cycles back into that room, right? So now she's in 2 places at the same time, but geographically speaking, she is not. She pops back into the room. Class proceeds. Presumably, this line is a hard out. Let's say this line is when class actually ends. She makes sure that as soon as class ends here, she is out of the room. Therefore, the version of her that was in classroom 1 can pop into classroom 2 and then begin the loop. Right?
Without seeing her. Without seeing
her, right. So
because when
works super well.
Right. And that's the other thing too, when you're talking about they say you must not interact with anyone. It's not necessarily the pebble throwing through the window and hitting Harry in the head is technically an interaction, but it's not a direct interaction in a face-to-face where you're seeing yourself, right? Because she says that to him when he wants to just run in there and talk about Sirius or grab Pettigrew, or Scabbers in that case, who's in Ron's hand, and Hermione's like, you can't do that, crazy things happen to wizards who meddle with time travel, Harry, so she establishes the rule again in that really early on in when they've traveled back in time that like you cannot see yourself. You will go mad. Basically, you will like absolutely go crazy. So
And to be fair, like that does happen, right? I mean, granted, like Harry doesn't get a full look at himself at his future self, right?
right,
Um, because like his soul is being eaten, but like he does see himself, and he does say something that's actually kind of insane. He says, "It was my dad," right?
right,
Um, I think like the reason why it doesn't break his brain is because like he can't fully see himself, right? But like he does
right.
end up saying something actually crazy. Um, so in a way, Hermione was right. He just didn't get the full impact because he couldn't fully see himself, right?
Right.
At least that's
Yeah,
what I'm sticking. Um,
that
so
works.
I think as far as the mechanic works, I think the mechanic actually works super well. There
It
is
does.
one flaw though. There's one flaw, um, and it's not necessarily that big of a deal, but like, okay, so when Harry and Hermione do the time turner, right? They end up back in the tower or the hospital wing,
Yeah,
right?
I was waiting for this too. This is what I was going to bring up. Yep.
Oh, maybe we're talking about something different. I'm interested to hear what you're going to say, but presumably she doesn't know who's going to be in the hospital wing at that time, right? It's
Yep.
empty.
100%. Yep.
Yeah. So
100%.
they
This is
just
what I. This is the. Yep. Go ahead. I totally
so they
agree
just
with you.
they just pop into the hospital wing. No harm, no foul. No one's there.
Right.
But Hermione throughout the film keeps popping into the classrooms because she's using the time turner when she's in an empty classroom to go back in time. Presumably she has an assigned seat, so she's not going to, pop into somebody, right?
Right.
So she sits in her assigned seat, she does the time travel, and then she just pops into that reality. Ron is usually the first person to notice. Granted, he doesn't see her ever pop in. Um, but presumably someone sitting behind her definitely sees her pop in, and just nobody else says anything. Like,
Right.
granted, I'm sure weird shit like this in Hogwarts happens all the time, but like nobody has an exclamation like, "Oh shit!" Like, you know how jarring that would be?
Yeah, that's a great. It's almost the thing that I was worried about. You took it a step further, but for me, it was more about like it's just really lucky that no one was in the hospital 3 hours earlier. Like they didn't run into anyone at all, like leaving it either. It was just totally convenient, basically. Um, that's the only thing I was thinking of. But that is also a very good point. I imagine she's able to pop in maybe right before before most people get into the class. Well, no, I guess that's true. That's not true because she's literally popping in like Ron's pointing out like, where did you come from? So she wasn't there first, basically. So she really is popping in like in real time, basically. There's some of these classrooms like just being started. So that's interesting. But it does as far as like, does the movie establish a time travel rules? Yes. Does it stick to its time travel rules that it established? Yeah, pretty much. So it does a really good job. It keeps it really simple. It's helpful that it's magic, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of things are easily explained with magic.